The United States. Ever since their declaration of independence in 1776, the United States have been a part of many wars. After all, their independence was forged in a revolutionary war against the British. This isn't a one-of-a-kind example. By the contrary, a large number of countries throughout history achieved their independence through war. One other example is Portugal fighting against Castile to become its own kingdom. But throughout its almost 250 years of existence, military conflicts have been a big part of the United States' existence. Again, not an exception, it has been so for almost all countries, although the US do set themselves apart for being involved in more recent conflicts than other nations. Throughout all their history, when it comes to official conflicts, there have been at least 106 of them. In 81, they were victorious. Only 10 times they were defeated, with the first defeat only coming in 1866, so they went almost 100 years undefeated. That is impressive. 11 of them were either unresolved, settled with a pre-war status quo, or unclear, and 4 of them are still ongoing. Although, remember, the size of these wars is not considered. World War II is listed as a win in the same way the occupation of Utah against the Mormon colonists is. But through all of those conflicts, some wars that the US was a part of were defensive, others were offensive, but in many wars categorized as either one thing happened: US invasions. You see, other than the Revolutionary War itself, some other early wars with the British, Mexicans, and Native Americans, and then the Civil War, there's been no war fought in the continental United States for a long time. In the latter, you can even consider it a foreign invasion, as it was Americans versus Americans. Even in World War II, the contiguous 48 saw no conflict in their own land, and only Hawaii and other Pacific islands were invaded by the Japanese. This is because in every other war that the US were a part of, whether having started the conflict or not, they were the invading force fighting the battle in another country's territory. In this video, we're going to do 2 things. First, provide a brief overview of all the conflicts the US have been a part of throughout its history where an invasion took place. Not listing them all in detail, but learning where they happened. Second, choose a few key examples of those and go through them specifically, understanding when, why, and how some countries were invaded by the United States. Let's move forward with the overview. It's important to note that it's difficult to categorize all conflicts that the US have been a part of, especially the ones that they invaded a country in. Not only do they differ in the type of conflict that it was, whether it was fought on land, sea, air, or a combination of those, posing the question, do we only consider an invasion if it was done with boots on the ground? I will use this criteria for the video, excluding conflicts that were exclusively naval and or air. Second, listing the countries which have been invaded by the US is a challenge in itself. For instance, in the Spanish-American War, the US invaded the territories of Cuba and the Philippines, which were controlled by the Spanish. Do we consider the invaded country Spain, even though American troops were never in Spain per se? Or do we consider Cuba and the Philippines as the invaded ones, even though the countries were not established at the time? I would argue the first one is the more correct option, as at the time, it was Spanish territory that was being invaded, even if not its European mainland. Although this isn't the best example because both Cuba and the Philippines were also invaded on their own, but anyway. We must also differentiate military conflicts and wars from participation or aid in foreign civil wars or coups d'etats, even when they were organized by the US themselves. For the sake of this video, I will leave both these cases out. With that being said, let's provide a visual list of invasions through this map. I'm going to fill in the countries as I list them, but of course they didn't invade the entirety of the countries, keep that in mind, and assuming the Spanish criteria, so I'll be considering the invaded countries the ones that controlled the territories at the time. The US has, in no particular order, invaded the following nations: the British, Canada, Northern American natives, the historic predecessors of modern Libya, Tunis, Morocco, Algiers, all of which were protectorates of the Ottomans, Mexico, Qing China, the Joseon dynasty, and then Korea, Germany, both the Empire and the Third Reich, Italy, Spain, the Philippines, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Austria, Japan, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and also Grenada and Panama. There's also other small examples of US troops invading the land of other countries, but that aren't necessarily included in a specific conflict, and tons of other countries and regions where US troops have been or are that we could fill in on this map, but I wanted to keep this exclusive to official invasions. Again, it's very confusing to categorize all of them, so this list might be incomplete or slightly off in some cases. If you notice any mistakes or missing nations, feel free to point them out in the comments. So now that we've provided that overview, let's look at some specific examples that show us the types of invasions these were, why they happened, when, and how. Immediately at the start of the 19th century was the first overseas invasions by the United States, the First Barbary War in 1801, which took place in the Ottoman protectorates of Tripolitana as well as in Morocco. The Ottoman protectorates of the Barbary states wanted to charge protection fees so that US ships wouldn't be raided by them. They refused to pay and so went into war. It was mostly a naval conflict, but the US did actually invade with a few hundred men, and this invasion was the turning point of the conflict through the Battle of Derna, when a mercenary army recruited and led by US Marines marched through the North African desert from Alexandria in Egypt to the eastern port city of Derna in Libya, defeating the Corsairs. The Second Barbary War in 1815 also saw overseas invasion, this time in Algiers for the same reasons, but the invasion was literally just at the end of the conflict, 99.9% of which was naval, and they also won this one. The next invasion of a foreign country was the Mexican-American War in 1846. Following the American annexation of Texas, which Mexico considered theirs, the two recently independent North American nations went to war. Not only did the US want Texas, but also to follow the idea of manifest destiny and continue expanding west into territories that were at the time part of the Mexican Empire. The US won, and the territories of the current states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico were conquered. Conflicts with Mexico existed various times throughout history, with many other examples taking place, like the Mexican Border War of 1910, the last major conflict fought on American soil, and somewhat connected to World War I, although not really. There were just some specific Mexican revolutionary factions that decided to attack border towns, but since the German Empire went in Mexico to attack the US, they supported them apparently. Having already been involved in invasions in North America and Africa, Asia was next, with the Second Opium War in China in 1856. Siding with the UK and France, the US fought and won against the Chinese. This was a colonial war over the right to import opium to the country. The US weren't a big part of the war, but offered aid to the UK, and a Chinese garrison at Canton shelled a US steamer, leading to the Battle of the Pearl River Forts, where the US launched an amphibious assault against a series of forts in what is today Guangzhou, China. They returned to China in 1899 with the Boxer Rebellion. This was an anti-colonial uprising, so all the colonial powers united against them, and the US was one of them, forming the Eight-Nation Alliance. The Boxers had the colonial legation quarter of Beijing surrounded, and so this Eight-Nation army moved on to break the siege. In this painting, we can even see US troops climbing the walls of Beijing and placing an American flag on top of them. There were also other small conflicts in which US soldiers took place during these uprisings. And after a few internal wars against the natives, they were back to Asia in 1871 through the US expedition to Korea against the Joseon dynasty, mostly taking place in the Guangwa Island. The reason for the presence of the American land forces in Korea was to support an American diplomatic delegation sent there and led by the US ambassador to China. The Koreans didn't want a trade treaty and requested the US not to go into their territory, with them ignoring the request, and so the Koreans attacked the ship that was in their territorial waters. In retaliation, about 650 Americans landed and captured several forts, culminating in the Battle of Gangwa. A news article from the time makes the argument that it was the US ambassador's plan to demonstrate American power over what he considered to be a weaker nation. Also, of course, having been fully involved in another Korean War later in history in 1950, fighting alongside the South and invading the North. A key part in conflict within the Cold War, placing North and South Korea against each other, one supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the other by the US. This war was unresolved and remains so up to today. Next, we have Germany, which was invaded by the US 3 times throughout its history. The first was the Second Samoan Civil War in 1898, where the US, UK, and Germany were fighting over who should control Samoa. They ended up splitting it into an American and German colony. The German one is now independent Samoa. Then World War I, where they also invaded Austria-Hungary, and World War II, where they also invaded Italy, fighting through various other European territories that were under the control of these nations at the time. A key invasion target of the US was also Spain, although, as we saw, not in its European mainland, as I pointed out on the map. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the final destruction of the Spanish Colonial Empire. It began with US participation in the Cuban War of Independence and then the Philippine Revolution. The US won, and Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Following that war and the loss of these territories by Spain, the US also invaded both of these nations. Although the Philippines war was immediately after, with the locals fighting for independence, however, the US won and the Philippines became an unincorporated territory of the United States, while the conflict with Cuba was only much later in history in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed military invasion attempting to overthrow their revolutionary government. Moving past Mexico, there were also several other US interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, such as Nicaragua in 1912, siding with the regime against revolutionary forces to stop any other nation from building a Nicaraguan canal, Haiti in 1915, with the landing of 300 soldiers in the capital of Port-au-Prince to take control of Haiti's political and financial interests, protecting American businesses there. There's a series of US invasions and occupations in Central American nations to secure their own business interest, known as the Banana Wars. The Dominican Republic in 1916, following a local revolution that wasn't friendly to the US and leading to the establishment of an American-sponsored puppet government. Grenada in 1983 was the same, with the US not accepting a revolutionary government and invading to restore the previous one. Panama in 1989, where the primary purpose was to depose their de facto ruler, General Manuel Noriega, who was wanted by US authorities, and Haiti again in 1994 to remove a military regime and restore the previous government. At the end of the 20th century, several invasions in Southeast Asia also took place. Vietnam in 55, Laos in 59, and Cambodia in 67, all of these resulting in a catastrophic defeat by the US in 1975. They were all a part of the Cold War too, with the Soviet Union and China supporting one side and the US the other. US interventions had to do with wanting to stop the spread of Soviet influence to the rest of Asia. And finally, the Middle Eastern area was time and time again invaded by the US. Beginning with the Lebanon crisis in 1958, when Lebanese president requested US intervention to stop a political and religious crisis. It was part of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which aimed to provide assistance to any Middle Eastern country that was being threatened by armed aggression, also seeking to prevent the expansion of communism into the region, returning to Lebanon in 1982 in a multinational intervention to establish a peacekeeping mission for the country's internal conflict. Then they also invaded Iraq, first in 1990 and then again in 2004, the first being to stop Iraq from annexing Kuwait, and the second due to false pretense of stopping the usage of weapons of mass destruction, and Afghanistan also in 2001 for region stabilization purposes, arguably having very much the opposite effect. So, that is a brief overview of all the times US soldiers have invaded the territory of another country within the context of an official conflict, attempting to provide an important piece of context that there are far more US military interventions and wars that they have taken part in, but that for this video, the point was only to consider nations they have physically invaded on the ground with their own soldiers, also considering the invaded country, the nation in control of those invaded territories at the time, and not necessarily the countries that exist there today, leaving out naval and aerial only conflicts, as well as US participation in coups or internal conflicts of other nations, providing a potentially complete list of all these countries the US have invaded and understanding in which parts of the world that happened. Then going through a good number of specific examples of US invasions and learning where, why, and how those invasions happened, which I believe provide us with a good understanding of what events have triggered them throughout history, either to expand their territory, safeguard trade, safeguard business interests, or keep other powers from expanding their spheres of influence, in addition to a few legitimate defenses against forces of evil, if you will, and why, at least in modern times, they seem to take part in more external conflicts than almost any other nation in the world. What is your opinion about these invasions? Are any other big ones missing? And which other countries have a history of foreign invasions or being invaded? Let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge.